This is the Rothschild family, and this is the truth about how they supported Israel not only by owning it, but by spending the equivalent of over $800 million of their banking fortune to fund the settlements that would become part of its foundation, starting with a single desperate letter that arrived at Baron Edmond James de Rothschild's Paris mansion in 1882. The letter came from a group of Jewish refugees who had fled the brutal pogroms tearing through Russia and Romania. And what they were asking for seemed impossible. They wanted money to buy land and farm in Ottoman-controlled Palestine, a place where disease killed faster than drought, where the Ottoman authorities watched every move with suspicion, and where previous attempts at Jewish agricultural settlement had failed miserably. But Edmond James de Rothschild wasn't just any banker. He was a member of the wealthiest family in Europe, a man who could write a check that would feed a village for a year without even noticing the money was gone. And more importantly, he was a man searching for something that all his families gold couldn't buy, a legacy that mattered beyond the ledgers and the mansions and the art collections that filled his life. When he read that letter describing families living in caves, children dying from malaria, crops failing in soil that hadn't been properly farmed in centuries, something shifted in him. His advisors told him it was madness, that he'd be pouring francs into sand, that these settlements would collapse within months just like all the others had. His own family questioned whether this was really how a Rothschild should spend the family fortune, not on sure investments or expanding the banking empire, but on what looked like a charitable fantasy in one of the most unstable regions of the Ottoman Empire. But on a morning in 1882, Edmond James de Rothschild made a decision that would cost him millions, would consume the next 40 years of his life, would save thousands of people from starvation and disease, and would help lay the groundwork for something much bigger than even he could imagine. And what started with that single letter would eventually lead to another letter, 35 years later, addressed to his nephew Walter Rothschild, that would change the course of Middle Eastern history forever. The first settlement Edmond chose to fund was called Rishon LeZion, which means first to Zion in Hebrew. And when he arrived there in 1883 to see what his money had bought, what he found was 40 families living in conditions that would have broken most men's spirits. Wooden shacks with dirt floors, a single well that barely produced enough water for drinking, let alone irrigation, and fields of withered grapevines that looked more like twisted sticks than anything capable of producing fruit. The settlers had been there for a year, and they were failing. Most of them were intellectuals from Russia, teachers and bookkeepers and scribes, who had never held a plow in their lives, now trying to coax crops from soil they didn't understand, in a climate that swung from scorching heat to unexpected frost. Edmond stood in those fields and made a choice that would define everything that followed. He wouldn't just give them money and walk away. He would rebuild everything from the ground up, and he would control every detail. Within months, French agronomists arrived with instructions written in Edmond's own hand. Engineers came to dig new wells and design irrigation systems, and doctors were dispatched to fight the malaria that was killing settlers at a terrifying rate. He purchased thousands of additional acres of land, negotiated with Ottoman officials who could shut down the entire project with a single decree, and established strict rules about how the settlements would operate, what crops would be planted, how the land would be divided, even what language would be spoken in the schools he built. The settlers called him the Baron, with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, because while his money was keeping them alive, his control was suffocating. By 1890, Edmond had expanded his support to multiple settlements: Zikron Yaakov, Rosh Pina, Yesod HaMa'ala, Metala, and the costs were staggering even by Rothschild standards. He was spending roughly 200,000 francs per year on the Palestine settlements, the equivalent of about $20 million annually in today's money, and his administrators in Paris were keeping meticulous records that showed exactly where every franc was going. 50,000 for land purchases from Arab landowners, 30,000 for agricultural equipment and livestock, 40,000 for salaries of the French experts he'd hired, $25,000 for medical supplies and doctors, $20,000 for schools and teachers, and the rest for emergency provisions when harvests failed or disease struck. But what those ledgers couldn't capture was the human drama unfolding in those settlements. The stories that Edmond heard during his periodic visits to Palestine, like the family in Rishon LeZion, who lost 3 children to malaria in a single summer, or the agronomist from Montpellier who spent 2 years draining swamps before finally succumbing to the same disease he was trying to prevent, or the young couple from Romania who planted an orange grove with their own hands and watched it flourish into something that would still be producing fruit a century later. Edmond walked through vineyards that his money had planted, tasted wine produced in the winery he'd built in Rishon LeZion, and visited the glass factory he'd established in Zichron Yaakov to give settlers an alternative source of income when farming wasn't enough. He saw children learning Hebrew in schools that didn't exist before his involvement, and he watched as settlements that had been on the verge of collapse transformed into functioning agricultural communities that were actually producing exports: wine, almonds, silk from the silkworm farms he'd funded. But this was just the beginning of the complications that would define his entire project. The settlers were growing restless under his paternalistic control, and by 1898 a full-scale rebellion was brewing. They called themselves the Farmers' Federation, and they had a list of demands. They wanted the right to make their own decisions about what to plant. They wanted ownership of the land, instead of just working it under Edmond's supervision. They wanted the French administrators gone and replaced with local leadership, and most of all, they wanted to be treated like partners in this enterprise instead of grateful recipients of charity. The confrontation came to a head during one of Edmond's visits, when a delegation of settlers presented their grievances directly to the man who had spent millions keeping them alive. The meeting was tense, with voices raised in Hebrew, French, and Yiddish, accusations flying about mismanagement and control. And underneath it all was a question that nobody wanted to say out loud: was Edmond funding these settlements because he believed in their future, or because he enjoyed playing God with other people's lives? Edmond listened to their complaints, and then he did something that surprised everyone in that room. He agreed to transfer control of the settlements to the Jewish Colonization Association, stepping back from daily management while continuing to provide financial support. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but it kept the project alive. And that was what mattered most. The human cost of this experiment was never far from Edmond's mind, especially when he received reports of deaths that his money couldn't prevent. Malaria was the constant enemy, killing settlers faster than new immigrants could arrive, and the doctors he employed were fighting a disease they barely understood with quinine supplies that were always running short. One settlement, Metula, lost so many people to fever in its first 5 years that it nearly became a ghost town, saved only by Edmond's insistence on funding extensive drainage projects that turned swampland into farmable soil. The work was brutal men standing waist-deep in stagnant water for hours, digging channels while mosquitoes swarmed around them, knowing that the very work meant to save lives was exposing them to the disease. And yet they kept digging, because the alternative was abandoning everything and admitting that this entire vision was impossible. Edmond received letters from widows whose husbands had died in those swamps, and he responded with pensions and promises to educate their children. But no amount of money could erase the guilt that came with funding a project where death was so common that settlements kept cemeteries ready for. Expansion. The Ottoman authorities added another layer of danger to everything Edmond was trying to build. The Sultan's government in Constantinople watched these growing Jewish settlements with increasing suspicion, and local Ottoman officials had the power to deny building permits, refuse land sales, or simply shut down entire communities if they decided these settlers posed a threat to Ottoman control. Edmond learned to navigate this treacherous political landscape through a combination of bribery, diplomacy, and careful cultivation of relationships with Ottoman administrators who could be persuaded to look the other way. He paid for permits that shouldn't have been necessary, made donations to local governors that ensured his settlements wouldn't be harassed, and employed Ottoman citizens as workers and supervisors to demonstrate that these Jewish farms weren't some foreign invasion, but were contributing to the local economy. It was exhausting work that required constant attention, and there were times when entire settlements hung in the balance, while Edmond's representatives negotiated with Ottoman officials, who could destroy everything he'd built with a single decree. By 1900, Edmond had been funding these settlements for 18 years, and the scope of what he'd created was becoming clear. Roughly 40,000 people were living and working in communities that existed because of his financial support. Thousands of acres had been transformed from wasteland into productive farms, and an entire infrastructure of schools, hospitals, and industry had been established where none had existed before. But the financial burden was also becoming clear. He'd spent approximately £6 million over those 18 years, a sum so vast that even the Rothschild fortune felt the impact. And his own family was questioning whether this project would ever become self-sustaining, or whether it would require perpetual subsidies from the family banking empire. Edmond's response was to double down, transferring even more land into trust for the settlers, establishing new industries including a perfume factory in Zikron Yaakov that processed local flowers, and expanding the wine operations until Rishon LeZion was producing bottles that were being exported to Europe bearing the Rothschild name. He believed that eventually, these settlements would prove that Jewish agricultural communities could not only survive in Palestine, but could thrive, producing exports, and creating a functioning economy that would justify every franc he'd invested. The settlers themselves were transforming in ways that Edmond hadn't fully anticipated. They were developing a new identity that was neither fully European nor traditionally Middle Eastern, speaking Hebrew in daily life, farming land that their grandparents had never seen, and raising children who knew Palestine as home rather than exile. The schools Edmond funded were teaching a curriculum that mixed traditional Jewish texts with modern agriculture and science, creating a generation that could quote Talmud and also graft fruit trees, that studied Torah and also understood irrigation engineering. This cultural transformation was perhaps Edmond's most lasting contribution. Though it would take decades for anyone to fully recognize it, he wasn't just funding farms. He was funding the creation of a new type of Jewish community that would become the template for much of what followed. But what Edmond didn't know in 1900, as he reviewed the latest reports from his settlements and authorized another massive transfer of funds, was that the most dramatic chapter of this story was still 17 years away. And it would involve not him, but his nephew Walter, a man who shared the Rothschild name but had taken a very different path in life. And it would come in the form of a letter that would be read around the world and would transform everything Edmond had built from a private philanthropic project into a matter of international politics and British imperial strategy. But this story becomes even more incredible when you see what happened with Andrew Carnegie during almost the exact same time period. Because while Edmond de Rothschild was pouring his fortune into settlements in Palestine, Carnegie was doing something remarkably similar in America, spending his steel empire wealth to build 2,509 libraries across the United States, Canada, and other English-speaking countries between 1883 and 1929. And the parallels between these two men reveal something profound about what happens when private fortunes try to reshape society. Carnegie started his library project just 1 year after Edmond received that desperate letter from the settlers, and his motivations were strikingly similar. He was a man with more money than he could ever spend, searching for a legacy that would outlast the steel mills and the stock portfolios, wanting to believe that his wealth could create something permanent and meaningful. He wrote checks that totaled over $56 million for library construction, which translates to roughly $1.6 billion in today's money. And just like Edmond, he faced immediate criticism for the way he tried to control every detail of what his money created. Carnegie had strict, non-negotiable rules that communities had to follow. If they wanted his library money, they had to provide the land. They had to commit to annual funding for operations. They had to agree to keep the libraries free and open to all citizens. And they had to build according to architectural plans that Carnegie's foundation approved. Communities that balked at these requirements found their applications rejected, and towns that accepted the money discovered that Carnegie's representatives would show up to inspect construction and ensure every specification was being followed exactly. The resentment this created was real and immediate, with newspaper editorials attacking Carnegie for trying to buy control over American towns. Critics pointing out that his library philanthropy was funded by the same fortune he'd made while paying his steelworkers poverty wages. And communities that felt humiliated by having to essentially beg a single man for the public infrastructure they needed. One town in Massachusetts rejected Carnegie's library offer entirely, with the mayor declaring that they would rather have no library at all than accept money from a man who treated American citizens like supplicants asking for charity. But Carnegie kept building, kept writing checks, kept sending his inspectors to make sure his vision was being followed. And slowly, the libraries began to transform American life in ways that even his critics couldn't deny. Children in small towns who had never owned a book were suddenly walking into marble buildings filled with thousands of volumes. Farmers were reading agricultural journals that taught them new techniques. Immigrants were learning English from free classes held in Carnegie reading rooms. And entire communities were gathering in spaces that existed solely because one man's fortune had made them possible. The difference between Carnegie's libraries and Edmond's settlements, though, was that libraries are fundamentally uncontroversial. Nobody objected to the idea of free books. Nobody saw a Carnegie library as a threat to their community or their country. And nobody worried that these buildings would eventually declare independence or claim sovereignty over American territory. Edmond's project was infinitely more complex, because he wasn't just building neutral public infrastructure. He was funding the creation of communities that had political implications from the very beginning. Settlements that existed in someone else's empire, populated by people who were developing their own national identity on land that multiple groups claimed as their ancestral home. When Carnegie built a library in Indiana, the people of Indiana celebrated and moved on with their lives. When Edmond funded a settlement in Palestine, it created ripples that would eventually become waves that would reshape an entire region's political landscape. Both men faced the same fundamental tension between philanthropic generosity and paternalistic control. Both spent fortunes that seemed incomprehensible to ordinary people. Both created institutions that outlasted them and transformed the lives of thousands. But only one of them was funding, something that would eventually require armies and treaties and international recognition to survive. Carnegie could measure his success in books circulated, and literacy rates improved. Edmond had to measure his success in settlers who didn't die from malaria, in crops that didn't fail, in Ottoman officials who didn't shut down his communities, and eventually, in whether the political winds of empires would blow in favor of what he'd spent decades building. And here's what makes the comparison so revealing. Carnegie's libraries are remembered today as an almost purely positive legacy, criticized mainly for the conditions in his steel mills rather than for the libraries themselves, while Edmond's settlements became inseparable from one of the most contentious political situations in modern history, praised by some as visionary philanthropy and condemned by others as the private funding of colonization. The lesson in comparing these two fortunes and what they built is this: private wealth can absolutely reshape society, can create institutions that outlive their founders, can change the trajectory of communities and even nations, but the legacy of that wealth depends entirely on what it builds and where it builds it, and whose land it builds on, and what political forces eventually claim ownership of the vision. And that brings us back to the Rothschild story at its most dramatic moment, because by 1914, everything Edmond had built over 3 decades was hanging in the balance as World War I erupted and the Ottoman Empire chose the wrong side, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain and France, which meant that Palestine was now enemy territory, and the future of every settlement Edmond had funded was suddenly dependent on which army would control that land when the war finally ended. Edmond was in his 70s by then, watching from Paris as the geopolitical chess game played out, knowing that all his millions and all his careful diplomacy with Ottoman officials meant nothing now that empires were redrawing the map with artillery instead of negotiations. But this was when his nephew Walter Rothschild entered the story in a way that would eclipse even Edmond's massive financial contributions. Because Walter had spent years cultivating relationships with British political leaders, and he'd become close friends with Chaim Weizmann, a brilliant chemist who had helped the British war effort by developing a process for synthesizing acetone needed for explosives, and who was also the most effective Zionist lobbyist in London. Weizmann understood something that Edmond's checkbook alone could never accomplish, that what the Jewish settlements in Palestine needed wasn't just money. It was international political legitimacy, a formal declaration from a world power that would transform these private philanthropic communities into something with legal and diplomatic standing that other nations would have to recognize. Throughout 1916 and 1917, Weizmann worked tirelessly on the British cabinet, arguing that a public declaration of support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine would serve British interests by creating a loyal population in a strategically vital region. And he used Walter Rothschild as his conduit to the highest levels of British power, because a letter delivered to a Rothschild carried weight that a letter to Weizmann alone never could. The British Foreign Secretary was Arthur Balfour, a complex man who combined genuine religious sympathy for the Zionist cause with cold imperial calculation about post-war Middle Eastern control, and after months of cabinet debates, diplomatic maneuvering, and careful wording that tried to promise something significant to Jewish Zionists while not completely alienating Arab populations or French imperial ambitions, Balfour finally authorized what would become known as the Balfour Declaration. On November 2, 1917, a letter was typed on Foreign Office stationery and addressed to Dear Lord Rothschild. And those 67 words would change everything that Edmond had spent 35 years building. The letter declared that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, with careful qualifications about protecting the rights of non-Jewish communities and not prejudicing the rights of Jews in other countries. Language that was deliberately vague enough to mean almost anything depending on how it was interpreted. Walter Rothschild received that letter and immediately understood its magnitude. This wasn't just another piece of diplomatic correspondence. This was the British Empire, the most powerful force on earth at that moment, putting its official stamp on the idea that Jewish settlement in Palestine wasn't just acceptable, but was something Britain would actively support. The letter was published in newspapers around the world within days, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Zionists celebrated it as the breakthrough they'd been fighting for. Arabs in Palestine and across the Middle East saw it as a betrayal and a threat, and European Jews debated whether this was a genuine opportunity or a dangerous trap that would make them targets in their current countries. Edmond read the declaration from Paris and must have felt something extraordinary validation that his decades of private funding had been building toward something that now had the backing of an empire, but also perhaps some trepidation about what he'd helped set in motion. Because a letter from the British Foreign Office was very different from a check from a private banker. And what Britain was promising wasn't just agricultural settlements, but a national home. Language that implied something much more political than anything Edmond had ever explicitly funded. The timing was crucial, because just 1 month later, in December 1917, British General Edmond Allenby marched into Jerusalem and ended 4 centuries of Ottoman control over Palestine, which meant that the Balfour Declaration wasn't just a theoretical promise anymore, but was now British policy. In territory Britain actually controlled, the settlements that Edmond had kept alive through malaria and drought and Ottoman suspicion were suddenly under the protection of the empire that had just issued the most important political statement about Jewish settlement in Palestine that any government had ever made. Within months, British administrators were arriving in Palestine. Maps were being redrawn, and what had been Edmond's private philanthropic project was becoming absorbed into something much larger: a British mandate, international treaties, League of Nations oversight, and political movements that would spend the next 3 decades fighting over what exactly that national home language in the Balfour Declaration actually meant. Edmond lived until 1934, long enough to see the settlements he'd funded become part of a complex political entity under British control, long enough to watch immigration increase beyond anything his private funding could have supported alone. long enough to witness both the promise and the problems that came with transforming a philanthropic vision into a political reality, but not quite long enough to see the ultimate outcome of what that letter to his nephew had set in motion. The truth about the Rothschild family and Israel is far more complex and human than any conspiracy theory could capture. It's the story of one man who spent a fortune trying to save desperate refugees and build something lasting, and another man who received a letter that transformed private philanthropy into international politics. Edmond James de Rothschild didn't own Israel because nobody owns a nation. But his $800 million in today's money kept thousands of people alive when they would have died, turned swamps into farms, and created communities that became part of the foundation for what eventually emerged 3 decades after that. Balfour Declaration was written. The Rothschild name became permanently linked to Israel's history, not through secret control or hidden ownership, but through documented financial records, through settlements that still exist today bearing the names Edmond gave them, through wine bottles that still carry the legacy of the vineyards he planted, and through the messy, complicated, entirely human story of what happens when private wealth tries to rescue people in desperate circumstances and ends up helping to reshape the political geography of an entire region in ways that nobody in 1882 could have possibly predicted.